Right after I got promoted to major, in front of a full military hangar, my sister walked on stage and slapped me hard. Then, the colonel beside me stepped forward, looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Touch my wife again and see what happens." I'm Major Emily Reese, United States Air Force, 34 years old, and I've lived most of my adult life inside the clean, rigid lines of military structure. Some people find comfort in routine. I didn't seek it, but I learned to breathe in it. Reveille at SO 530, training at 0600 meetings, reports evaluations. Days built like bricks, no surprises, no wasted space. My quarters were as quiet as they were precise. There were no photos on the walls, no clutter, no noise. The only personal object I kept within reach was a folded American flag, the one we received when my mother passed. My father had insisted it go to me. Vanessa didn't argue. She barely looked at it. I hadn't spoken to my sister in nearly 4 years. Last time I saw her, she stood outside our mother's hospital room with a look that could cut glass. Our father was standing behind her, smaller somehow, even though he was 6 feet tall in his prime. The air between us was thick with things unsaid, accusations I didn't refute, apologies I didn't offer. I'd missed the funeral by 16 hours. I didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't offer any. My father still lived in that house, the one we grew up in, peeling porch paint, overgrown hedges, the creaky screen door that never closed right. He was frailer now, his voice once commanding, now came through the phone like it was filtered through wool. He said Vanessa was taking care of him, said she was strong. I didn't ask for more. I wasn't built for family. I was built for execution, for orders, followed without hesitation. The Air Force didn't need me to feel anything deeper than duty, and that worked for a while. But as I stood in front of my mirror that morning, adjusting the creases in my dress blues, brushing invisible lint off my lapel, I didn't feel accomplished. I felt hollow, like I'd reached a summit, only to find it wrapped in fog. This was supposed to be a day of celebration. A promotion to lieutenant colonel was no small feat. My commanding officer, Colonel Logan Barrett, had made it clear that few had earned it as swiftly or cleanly as I had. I'd outperformed, outlasted, outdisciplined everyone in my cohort. But I couldn't shake the weight in my chest, like something was off kilter, like I'd left something behind on the runway. The base was unusually still for a morning ceremony. Peterson Air Force Base always buzzed at dawn engines, humming boots hitting pavement, low murmurs passing like smoke between hangars. But that day, it was quiet. Maybe it was the snow blanketing everything in soft white denial. Or maybe it was me moving through it all like a shadow, trying not to be seen. I passed by the enlisted quarters, saluted a pair of junior officers who nodded with a kind of reverence that made me uncomfortable. I didn't know what they saw in me, and I wasn't about to ask. I reached the hangar where the ceremony would be held, high ceiling rows of folding chairs, a makeshift stage dressed in flags and anticipation. The base commander had gone all in. There'd be speeches, a formal pinning, and more cameras than I liked. The chairs were already filling up uniforms, polished shoes, expectant faces. No one from my family would be there. That was decided long ago. Or maybe it had never been an option. Inside my office, away from the echo of prep and protocol, I took a moment to breathe. There was a framed commendation from my first deployment sitting on the shelf. It had been gifted by my unit back when I still smiled in photos. Next to it, tucked beneath the training schedule, was a letter I hadn't opened my father's handwriting on the envelope. Postmarked 3 months ago. I hadn't meant to ignore it. I just hadn't been ready to read whatever version of closure he thought we needed. I picked it up, thumbed the edge, then slid it back without opening it. Some days, silence feels easier than truth. A knock on the door pulled me back. Major Reese, came a voice. Sergeant Doyle, always punctual, always just formal enough. They're ready for you. I nodded, grabbed my cap and followed him out. The air in the hangar felt charged like the static before a lightning strike. Colonel Barrett was already on the stage, his stance firm, his face unreadable. He'd been my CO for 3 years, hard to know, harder to impress. But he'd always treated me with fairness and something more subtle, a kind of quiet respect that didn't need words. I took my place beside him. The flags behind us hung motionless, waiting. The audience hushed as he stepped forward. His voice was crisp, his cadence flawless, but I only half heard the words. My eyes scanned the crowd, then stopped there in the third row. Between 2 civilians sat a woman with familiar posture, hair pulled tight, jaw clenched. Vanessa. My stomach flipped, not with fear, but with something colder. She wasn't supposed to be here. She hadn't returned a single message, hadn't even acknowledged the promotion. And yet, here she was, wearing a black coat, like armor eyes locked on me like a target. I inhaled slowly and held it. I'd made peace with her absence. I wasn't prepared for her presence. I straightened my back, fixed my gaze forward, and reminded myself of the one rule that had always kept me steady, never flinch. But the moment I saw her, my sister sitting so still, so impossibly present, it was like every cell in my body remembered who she used to be to me. Before all of this, before uniforms and protocols and medals, Vanessa was my anchor. We were just 2 girls in a creaky house pretending the world didn't turn unless we said so. We built forts in the living room, snuck peanut butter from the jar, and whispered secrets under shared blankets. She was older by 4 years, but never made me feel like less. If anything, she pulled me forward, always ahead of me, but never out of reach. And I followed. Always. When Mum got sick, Vanessa stepped in like it was her natural post. She drove Mum to every appointment, sat through chemo rounds, learned how to adjust the oxygen tank when the nurse couldn't come. I was stationed overseas, caught in a deployment cycle that wouldn't break. I offered to come home. Vanessa told me not to. She said she had it under control, that I'd worked too hard to throw it away now. I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to. But then Mum took a turn. Fast. I caught a flight on a 3-day pass, knowing it wouldn't be enough, hoping it would be something. I landed in Denver, drove through the night, and pulled into the driveway just past dawn. The porch light was still on. The silence was already too loud. I walked in to find Vanessa sitting on the couch, arms folded, eyes empty. She passed last night, she said, not even looking up. I stood there, uniform still wrinkled from the flight, not sure whether to sit or run. "Where were you?" she asked. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Nothing I could say would bring Mum back or erase the hours she died without me. "Don't," she said, her voice low. "Just don't." She got up, walked past me and went upstairs. That was the last time we were under the same roof. The funeral happened without me. I stayed, but in the background. I wasn't part of the photo slideshow. I didn't give a eulogy. I watched as Vanessa stood beside our father, dry-eyed, composed. Everyone called her strong. They didn't see the cracks. I did. I just didn't go near them. What no one ever said out loud was that Vanessa had once wanted this life. The uniform, the wings, the flight path. She'd applied to the Air Force Academy the year I started middle school. She made it past the first round. Then Mum got diagnosed the first time, and she declined the interview. Said she couldn't leave. "Someone has to stay," she told Dad. He didn't argue. Later he told me she would have made a fine officer. I didn't know that story until years later, and by then it was too late to say anything that wouldn't sound like pity or guilt. Vanessa never brought it up, not even once. But sometimes, when she looked at me in uniform, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not resentment, exactly more like mourning. I tried to reach out after the funeral, called once. No answer. Texted on her birthday. No reply. Then I stopped. Not out of anger, out of resignation. She'd been the one who stayed. I'd been the one who left. That equation never balanced. Back in my office after the ceremony rehearsal, I sat at my desk and looked again at the letter from Dad. Still sealed. Still waiting. The handwriting was slower than I remembered he'd always written in block letters like an engineer even after retirement. Now it slanted unsure. I slid a finger under the flap, then stopped. Why now? Why today? Maybe because Vanessa was here? Maybe because I knew something was ending. Or starting. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated 6 weeks ago. Dear M, it began. He always called me that short and simple. I know I didn't do everything right. I didn't hold you two together the way your mother did. I watched you both carry too much and I didn't take enough off your shoulders. Vanessa took care of me when I should have taken care of her. You served your country when I should have told you to stay. I've had time to think and not much time left to fix things. I don't know how many days I have, but if there's one thing I want to see before I go, it's you two in the same room without the weight between you. My throat tightened. I kept reading. She was proud of you, Em. Your mother. She told everyone her daughter flew planes before she couldn't breathe on her own. Vanessa never said it, but she was proud too. I saw it. When you made captain, she printed the article from the base newsletter and stuck it on the fridge. I found it weeks later after she took it down. She didn't want you to know she'd been looking. I paused. That detail, that small, domestic truth landed heavier than any medal I'd ever earned. I can't make you talk. I can't make her forgive, but I can ask you to try. That's all. I love you. I love her. I just want some peace before I go. There was no sign-off. No dramatic ending. Just the weight of his hope folded neatly in my hands. Outside, the wind picked up. It howled through the cracks of the hangar like something alive, something aching to get in. I folded the letter, slowly returned it to the envelope, and tucked it into my breast pocket. Not for safekeeping. For memory. I wasn't ready to face Vanessa, but maybe, just maybe, I was ready to stop running. The hangar doors had already been opened when I returned, letting in slivers of icy air that mixed with the scent of oil and polished leather. Rows of chairs were neatly aligned, filled with uniforms in perfect formation. Friends, enemies, observers. Everyone who mattered or believed they did was already seated. The lights overhead hummed quietly, casting a clinical glow across the concrete floor. Every step I took toward the stage echoed. I didn't look at Vanessa again. Not yet. I climbed the 3 wooden steps' heels sharp against the grain and stood beside Colonel Barrett. He was still imposing, with hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look at me immediately, but when he did, it was with the same unshakable expression he always wore. Except today, there was something beneath it. I couldn't name it. Not yet. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice cutting clean through the murmurs. We are gathered here to recognise Major Emily Reese for her promotion to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in recognition of exceptional service leadership and commitment to the mission of the United States Air Force. A smattering of polite applause followed, too quick, too precise. No one wanted to be the first to show enthusiasm. The air was too thick with expectation, or judgment, or both. I stood at parade rest, eyes forward, jaw set. I could feel them watching, not just the civilians or junior officers, but the seasoned ones, the ones who'd spent 20 years clawing their way through ranks and still weren't standing where I was now. I knew the whispers. She got there fast. She's someone's favourite. Maybe more. Maybe too close to Barrett. No one ever said it out loud, but I saw the looks, felt the shift in tone when I walked into a room. And today, I could feel it magnified, every eye flicking between me and the colonel, measuring the distance, the timing, the implications. Barrett took the citation from a staff sergeant and read it without flourish, as if he were reciting a weather report. But his voice had weight, precision. Major Reese has consistently demonstrated operational excellence, strategic foresight, and unwavering dedication to the defense mission. Effective today, she is promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. He paused, then looked at me, not the glance of a superior, not entirely. It was heavier than protocol, like a warning, or a promise. I stepped forward. He removed the silver oak leaf insignia from the box and pinned it to my uniform with exacting care. His fingers brushed the fabric just once, deliberate and firm. "Congratulations, Colonel Reese," he said softly, "only for me." Then, louder, "Ladies and gentlemen, your new Lieutenant Colonel." The audience rose in another round of applause. Louder now, but still controlled. Military clapping has rules too. Behind their measured smiles, I felt something coil, a current beneath the surface. One of the junior officers in the second row, Lieutenant Shelby, fresh from academy, leaned toward his neighbour, whispered something. They both kept their eyes on me. I noted it, filed it, let it go, for now. From the corner of my eye, I spotted Vanessa still seated, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her expression unreadable, not proud, not angry, just locked. I wondered how it looked to her, me on stage, being honoured, receiving recognition for a life she might have had, or one she'd chosen to give up. Barrett stepped aside, giving me the mic for my remarks. I had none prepared. That was intentional. I hated rehearsed words. I took a breath long and slow. "Thank you," I said. "I stand here because of the teams I've served with, the leaders who challenged me and the people who've held me accountable. I'm grateful for the opportunity. I'll do my best to be worthy of it. Simple, clean, no emotion, no room for interpretation." I stepped back. The ceremony continued around me. More promotions, more handshakes, more speeches. I heard none of it. My eyes flicked across the crowd, picking up half conversations, the tilt of heads, the lean-ins. Everyone pretending not to speculate. Barrett remained silent beside me, statue-like, but I caught the way his jaw tensed when one of the civilians pulled out a phone and aimed it toward the stage. The storm hadn't broken yet, but it was coming. I didn't expect it to come from the third row. Vanessa moved faster than I remembered. She was halfway up the aisle before anyone registered what was happening. Dressed in black, her boots hit the concrete with sharp precision, as if every step was calibrated for impact. I saw her eyes as she closed the distance, fixed, unblinking, zeroed in. No hesitation, just fire. Then she was on the stage. No one stopped her. Not security, not officers, not the base commander who blinked in confusion as she passed him. Vanessa reached me, and without a word raised her hand and struck. The sound was crisp, final. It cracked across my face and echoed through the steel ribs of the hangar like a shot. My head snapped to the side, but I didn't stumble. I stood still. The applause died instantly. Even the humming lights seemed to still. There was no gasp, just silence, heavy and suffocating. "Mum died," she said, her voice loud, raw, shredding the air. "Where the hell were you?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't come off like a defense. And I knew better than to try and justify absence to someone who had stayed. The tension spread outward in waves. Officers frozen mid-clap, junior cadets rigid, eyes wide. One tech sergeant shifted his weight as if unsure whether to step in. He didn't. No one did, not even Barrett. I tasted copper. My cheek throbbed. I kept my eyes on Vanessa. She stood a foot away, chest heaving, every line in her face etched with more than anger. Grief lived there. And something else deeper, older. It wasn't just the funeral. It wasn't even the years of silence. It was all of it. The roles we played, the praise I received, the choices she never got to make. Lieutenant Darnell, fresh out of officer training school, took a single step forward unsure. I caught him in my periphery, young stunned, reaching instinctively for control. I cut him off without turning. "Back to your post, Lieutenant. The ceremony isn't over." He froze, blinked, then nodded and stepped back. Vanessa's lips parted, maybe to shout again, maybe to say something else. But nothing came out, just the quiet collapse of momentum. Her eyes scanned the room, rows of frozen uniforms, silent judgment. She'd made her statement. There was no retreat from it, just the consequences. For a second, I thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, I saw a flicker, something unexpected. Not regret, not yet, but vulnerability, jealousy. The kind that doesn't come from envy of success, but from being erased from someone's narrative. She turned, slowly stepped off the stage on her own, and made her way back down the aisle. The echo of her boots now sounded smaller, the fury drained from their rhythm. No one clapped, no one spoke. Beside me, Barrett exhaled through his nose, barely audible, but didn't move. I kept my hands at my sides, spine-straight uniform still immaculate, even as the heat on my cheek bloomed and pulsed. Shame, pride, duty, they all lived there in the exact same place. The flag behind me didn't move. Neither did I. Colonel Barrett stepped forward with slow, deliberate purpose. His boots landed like punctuation on the concrete stage. He stopped between us, me and Vanessa, his posture, coiled gaze hard enough to cut steel. For a moment, he didn't speak. Instead, he turned his head toward me, locking eyes. It was a question, not with words, but with silence. Was I going to handle this alone? Did I need him to step in? Would I allow it? I gave him nothing. No nod, no shake of the head, just a flat stare, the same one I'd used in field briefings, when uncertainty had to wear the mask of control. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then he turned toward Vanessa. The tone of his voice didn't rise, didn't growl. It was calm, clear, surgical. Touch my wife again and see what happens. The words sliced through the hangar, sharper than any reprimand, louder than any shout could have been. And, just like that, the air inside the building changed. There was no reaction at first, just confusion. Then the whispers. His wife. I felt them ripple like shockwaves down the rows of seats. A few people turned to each other in disbelief. One officer's eyes darted between Barrett and me, visibly calculating timelines, rumours, implications. Vanessa blinked, rocked backward as if slapped herself. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her entire stance faltered, not from fear, but from something more destabilizing. Uncertainty. She scanned the crowd again, and this time the cold judgment she had faced earlier had morphed into something less defined. Sympathy, suspicion, she couldn't tell. Neither could I. Two base security officers moved toward her, slow and respectful but firm. She didn't resist. She didn't look back at me. As they guided her down the aisle and out the hangar doors, her shoulders rose just slightly. Pride dying slowly. And then it was over. The hangar remained quiet. No one dared move yet. No one knew what the rules were now. I stayed in place, eyes forward, heartbeat loud in my ears. Barrett returned to his previous position, standing beside me like nothing had happened. He didn't look at me again, didn't explain, didn't elaborate. Wife. It echoed absurd and impossible. I wasn't married, not to him, not to anyone. And yet, for a split second, he'd changed the entire narrative, rewritten my position on the stage not just as an officer, but as someone personally shielded. He'd moved fast intentionally with just the right combination of personal stake and chain of command gravity to freeze the situation before it could spiral further. I should have felt protected. I should have felt grateful. I didn't. What I felt was uncertainty. Had he just taken a bullet for me, or had he redirected one? I scanned the rows again. The same young officers who had whispered earlier were now completely silent, their expressions blank but watchful, calculating. I wasn't naive. A statement like that delivered on a public stage during a formal military ceremony wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a tactical choice, controlled, timed, and executed for maximum effect. Not for me, maybe, but for the perception of me, for the integrity of the uniform, the image, and perhaps to cast a shadow over the real story. The kind of shadow no one would want to question too hard. I couldn't read his face. I didn't try to. The ceremony wrapped quietly after that. The base commander stepped back up, mumbled something generic about perseverance and honour. Polite applause followed. Barrett remained motionless beside me. I gave one final salute, then stepped down from the stage. No one stopped me. No one offered congratulations. Just silence thick and suspicious. I walked past the rows of chairs through the open doors into the biting Colorado wind, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just become someone else's camouflage. The officer lounge was empty when I got there. I didn't turn on the lights. The sun was low, casting long streaks of gold across the tile floor, slicing through the quiet like a blade. I sat at the edge of the leather couch, hands resting on my knees, not quite steady. My cheek still throbbed. The slap had left no visible bruise, but the shape of it clung to me like a second skin. I could feel the imprint in the silence. The deeper bruise was internal. The door creaked open. I didn't look up. I figured you'd be here, Barrett said. I said nothing. He closed the door behind him and crossed the room slow and careful, like he wasn't sure whether to sit or stay standing. Eventually, he settled into the armchair opposite me. We sat in quiet for a long moment, just the hum of the HVAC system filling the space. He cleared his throat. I don't regret stepping in. That's not what I asked, I said. He didn't blink. You haven't asked anything. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze. Would you have done it if I weren't under your command? His jaw worked. It wasn't anger, more like effort, the kind it takes to avoid the truth when you know it's standing in the room with you. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled. You were alone up there. I wasn't going to let it spiral. That's not a yes or a no. I didn't think you needed an answer. Wrong. He leaned back again, exhaled through his nose. You think it was a move? I think it was efficient, precise, effective. I looked away. That usually means deliberate. He let that sit. You want me to say it was personal. I want to know what people are going to think when they replay the footage. He nodded slowly. They'll think what they always think, that you didn't get here on merit, and you reinforced it. No, he said evenly. I gave them something else to chew on. You can either let them define you, or you can decide what the story is. And my wife is the story. It worked. Silence again. I didn't ask for protection, I said. He stood. Didn't say you did. And just like that, he walked out. The door clicked behind him. I sat there a while longer. The sun dipped below the horizon, washing the room in grey. I rubbed my hands together, suddenly cold. The silence had weight now, a strange, unpredictable pressure. I had no idea what came next, only that the base was already buzzing. Rumours moved faster than orders. By the time I returned to my office, the inbox on my base terminal was full. Unread messages stacked like bricks, half of them congratulations laced with uncomfortable subtext, the other half formal inquiries from the ethics board requesting a statement about the incident involving familial disruption during a formal military event. Code, of course, for everything they were afraid to put in writing. I didn't open them, not yet. There was something else waiting for me. On my desk, placed with quiet purpose, was a coin. Not the kind issued for achievements or campaigns. This one was old, worn at the edges, smaller than standard. One side bore the Air Force emblem, the other had a phrase etched into the metal in small, deliberate type. Steady doesn't mean silent. I turned it over in my palm, over and over. It wasn't from Barrett. I knew his style. He didn't leave symbols. He left consequences. No name, no note, just weight. The kind that lives in your pocket but never lets you forget it's there. Outside the window, lights flicked on across the tarmac. Inside the building, I heard movement voices in the hallway, hurried steps, a tone of urgency that always preceded gossip dressed as concern. Somewhere, a report was already being filed, and I hadn't even sat down yet. By morning, the air in the unit had shifted. I felt it the second I walked into the squadron building. The same faces that once nodded with familiarity now averted their eyes. One officer I used to grab lunch with weekly suddenly had a meeting he couldn't reschedule. A strategic planning session that normally would have included me somehow didn't. No one said anything direct. It was quieter than that, more efficient, the kind of exclusion that doesn't need a memo. It didn't take long to realize I'd become someone else's cautionary tale. That same afternoon, a formal envelope appeared on my desk, thick paper, deep blue seal. I opened it slowly like it might explode. It was an invitation to speak at the Joint Defense Leadership Program Conference in Washington, D.C., topic integrity under pressure. I almost laughed. The timing couldn't have been more surgical. Public image salvage or an actual opportunity to lead, I wasn't sure. But I accepted, because silence wasn't serving me. 2 days before departure, Barrett called me into his office. He didn't offer coffee, just looked at me from behind his desk and said, "You're going to DC." I nodded. Apparently so. He studied me a second longer. "Say what you need to say. You've earned that." I tilted my head. "Even if it reflects back on you." His lips thinned. "I don't make moves I'm not prepared to defend." I stood. Good. Because I don't plan to speak for anyone but myself. The night before the flight, I sat in my quarters with a blank pad and 5 balled-up drafts scattered around me. Everything I wrote sounded safe, detached, things a committee might nod at and forget 5 minutes later. That wasn't enough. I thought about my father's letter again, the way he wrote, honest, unfinished, flawed. I decided then I wouldn't speak to protect my reputation, or his. I'd speak because someone out there was still deciding how much of themselves they had to silence to survive in this system. The JDLP event was held in a towering building, lined with glass and framed credentials. The crowd was a sea of polished shoes and policy minds. I stepped onto the stage with no notes. My palms didn't sweat. My voice didn't shake. But my chest felt tight, like this wasn't just about me anymore. A week ago, I stood at my promotion ceremony and was struck across the face by my sister, in uniform, in front of my peers and leadership. The room fell quiet, breathless. She did it out of grief pain and a feeling that I'd abandoned her when our mother died. And I didn't flinch, not because I'm a hero, but because in that moment, holding ground meant more than responding. I continued, not with details to shame her or defend myself, but to lay bare what that moment represented, a lifetime of unspoken emotion, the pressure to appear perfect, and the cost of pretending you're unbreakable. Leadership, I said, isn't silence. It's knowing when to speak, even when your voice trembles, even when the truth might stain your uniform. One hand went up in the crowd. A major from another branch. Would you still have stood your ground if your commander hadn't stepped in? I looked him squarely. I stood before he did. I would have stood after. Applause was light but sincere, not unanimous, but earned. And as I stepped off stage, a tall, silver-haired woman waited near the exit. Her ribbon said she'd been through things I couldn't imagine. She didn't introduce herself, just said, "Thank you," for not editing the hard parts. I nodded, unable to speak for a second. That one comment meant more than any award. Later that night, in the hotel room, I opened a small envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a typewritten line on Air Force stationery. You stood for more than yourself. Some of us noticed. For the first time in days, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I folded the note carefully and placed it beside the coin on the desk. The same coin that reminded me silence wasn't always strength. The room was still save for the low hum of the air vent. I pulled out a second envelope yellowed with age, the one from Mum. I hadn't opened it in years. I don't know why I packed it for this trip, except maybe some part of me already knew I'd need to feel her voice again. I broke the seal slowly, carefully. Her handwriting was familiar, looped and slanted ink, slightly smudged like she'd written quickly emotionally. You both take after me, it read. Strong, stubborn, proud. But neither of you ever learned how to hug each other. I smiled, though it stung. She wasn't wrong. As I read on, I could almost hear her voice. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I know both of you are trying to grieve separately in silence, as if love were some burden you carry in private. But it isn't. It needs to be seen, heard, felt, no matter how messy. I swallowed. Grief has a strange weight, and hers hadn't lifted, it had just gone quiet over the years. A memory surfaced, simple, vivid. A night when Vanessa was 19, home from college for a weekend. I was 16. We sat at the kitchen table folding Dad's uniforms after a storm knocked out the power. The air was damp, the candlelight soft. She showed me how to fold the sleeves just right. The crease makes the soldier, she joked. I burned my finger on the iron and she laughed, real laughter, the kind that shakes your shoulders. It was the last night we laughed like that unguarded. I think about it more often than I admit. I turned the page. You girls never needed to be perfect for me, Mum wrote. You just needed to stay reachable. Don't let the silence win. One day it'll be too late to cross that bridge. And when that day comes, you'll wish for even one broken, awkward conversation more than 100 perfect memories. Her words tightened something in my chest. She always had a way of seeing what we hid. As I folded the letter back into its envelope, something else slipped free. A smaller note on different paper. It was Dad's handwriting sharp, all caps, the kind he used to label tools in the garage. Fix what I couldn't, it said. That was all. 4 words. No greeting, no signature. I stared at it longer than I should have. He'd watched the distance grow between us for years and, like many fathers of his era, said nothing. Maybe he didn't know how, or maybe he thought time would soften everything. It didn't. Time just made us better at pretending. I stood, walked to the dresser, where I kept the old photo album, buried under uniforms awards credentials. I hadn't opened it in a decade. I flipped through the pages slowly until I found the one I didn't know I'd been looking for. Me and Vanessa, aged 10 and 13, standing in our backyard wearing flight suits, made out of old bed sheets. She'd cut hers to fit me, stitched on a paper Reese name patch with glitter glue. I'd wanted to be a pilot because she had. And for a while I thought I was following her dream, not mine. Holding that photo now, I felt it differently. Not like nostalgia, but like a reminder. She hadn't always been angry. We hadn't always been distant. There had been love, loud, clumsy, deeply present love. We just stopped showing it. I returned to the desk, pulled out my field journal. On the first empty page, I wrote one sentence. Tomorrow, I'll write to her. That was it. No grand plan. No perfectly worded apology. Just a beginning. The thing about being in uniform for too long is sometimes you forget how to speak without directives, how to reach without rank. But I remembered tonight. I remembered because my mother had dared to speak when it was hardest, and my father, quiet, stoic, had left me a task heavier than any mission order. Outside, The wind moved through the trees. Inside, I sat with their words, the photo and a growing ache to close the space between the sister I had and the one I wanted back. The next morning, as I checked out of the hotel, the front desk clerk handed me a padded envelope. No return address, just my name scrawled in sharp, impatient cursive. I opened it in the car engine, off fingers, hesitating on the seal. Inside was a photo. Me and Vanessa, maybe 6 and 8, covered in mud, and grinning, standing proudly in front of a sagging structure made from lawn chairs, blankets, and stubborn imagination. Our fort, a war bunker by day, a spaceship by night. On the back of the photo were 5 words written in her unmistakable hand I don't forgive. But I remember. I didn't cry, I didn't smile either. I just stared. My thumb brushed over the plastic edge of the photo. She hadn't sent an apology, but she hadn't erased me either. She remembered us before the silence, before the sharp words and the absence at Mum's funeral. She remembered being my sister. I tucked the photo into my wallet, behind my Air Force ID, where no one would see it. It was too fragile for display. Some things lose their magic when exposed to too much light. That night, back at base, I pulled out an old footlocker I hadn't touched in years. Inside, under faded training manuals and a box of coins, was a torn squadron patch one Vanessa had given me the night before I shipped out for basic. She'd sewn it onto a scrap of her old hoodie, told me it was a backup badge in case the real ones ever let me down. I remembered laughing, brushing her off, thinking she was being dramatic. Now I held it with both hands. The stitching was frayed, the fabric thin, but it had survived. The photo, the patch. They weren't reconciliation, but they were proof that something between us hadn't died, just gone underground. I thought back to that day in the backyard. The mud, the yelling, the way she barked orders like a miniature drill sergeant. She drew a chalk perimeter on the patio and assigned me sentry duty. "You go down, I cover you," she'd said, eyes blazing with pretend fury. "We don't leave each other behind." It was the first oath I ever took. Later that week, Morales sat beside me at the mess hall. She was blunt as ever. "You okay? You look like someone lit a match in your gut." I smirked. "That obvious," she stirred her coffee. "Vanessa Reese. Your sister, right." I nodded, instantly alert. She sipped slowly. She applied to flight school once. Years ago, didn't get past the first round, but not for lack of talent. Family emergency, I think. Something about a parent's health. My jaw tensed. "You sure?" She nodded. She was good. Confident. One of those people who walked in and made you feel like you were already behind. I laughed softly. Yeah, that tracks. The pieces started to line up. I remembered the year Dad had his first heart scare. Vanessa dropped out of her physical therapy program to take care of him. I never asked why. I assumed she didn't want it bad enough, but she had. She'd just chosen differently. Chosen us. Back in my room, I pulled out my journal. The last page had that one sentence I'd written in DC. "Tomorrow I'll write to her." I hadn't yet. But now I added a second line. "Forgiveness isn't owed, but I'll wait. Every day if I have to." I tucked the journal beside my pillow and looked at the patch and the photo again. Maybe love wasn't a matter of grand gestures. Maybe it lived in quiet objects and things that carried our touch long after we forgot leaving it there. Maybe some bridges aren't crossed in leaps. Maybe they're built one photo, one frayed patch, one almost letter at a time. The morning I was due to leave Peterson, a light fog hung over the runway, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. I had packed, or light always did. The duffel bag on my shoulder sagged with the weight of essentials and memories I hadn't sorted yet. My boots echoed across the concrete as I made my way past the hangar for the last time. There was a stillness to departure that felt different from arrival. Not anticipation. Not exactly relief. Just a kind of quiet unhooking from something that had held you, even if you never fully embraced it. Waiting in the mail drop outside my quarters was a small folded piece of cloth. No envelope, no tag. I almost left it there. Almost. But something about the stitching caught my eye, neat, deliberate. I picked it up. A handkerchief, military issue, soft with age. In the bottom corner, a single letter had been sewn in dark thread V. I unfolded it slowly, careful not to miss what it was trying to say. Inside, tucked precisely at the centre, was my old squadron patch, the same one Vanessa had given me, the one I thought I'd lost, the one I had found again, and kept hidden. Except this patch looked cleaner, re-stitched, the edges reinforced. It had been repaired. No note, no signature, just the patch and that V. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was a gesture, soft, subtle, absolute. It said, I still remember. I still claim this. I still claim you. I stood there longer than I meant to, holding that handkerchief like it was made of something sacred. Maybe it was. Maybe not the cloth itself, but the care behind it. That kind of thread didn't fray easily. As I packed the final contents of my room, I glanced across the shelf where remnants of my years at Peterson lived. A photo of my first unit. The challenge coin Sophia had slipped into my palm after the JDLP session. A letter I had started to Vanessa but never finished. I slipped that letter into my journal along with the handkerchief. One day, maybe. The fog outside hadn't lifted. I made my way toward the motor pool where a few junior officers were drilling under the eye of a stern sergeant. Their uniforms, 2 crisp movements a beat too eager. I watched them for a moment, then moved on. Barrett was waiting by the jeep, his hands in his pockets, eyes distant. Got word your transport's 5 minutes out, he said. His voice was neutral, steady. I'll be ready, I replied. He turned to me. They're still talking about that line. Let them, I said. He nodded slowly. You stood your ground. That's rarer than people think. There was a pause before he added, that day after the slap. I didn't say it then, but I said it the only way I could. I didn't ask what he meant. We both knew. He extended his hand. I took it. The grip was firm. Military. But something else passed through it, respect certainly, but maybe also a kind of unspoken pact. The kind shared by people who had each absorbed something sharp on the other's behalf. He didn't mention wife, not once, and I didn't ask. It wasn't romantic, not really. It never had been. The wife line had been about optics, about drawing a line when the cameras came out and giving the base something simple to process, instead of the messy truth of blood and betrayal. Maybe it had been strategy, maybe it had been protection, but it had worked, and it had cost him too. We let go. I climbed into the jeep. As we pulled away, I looked back once. Barrett hadn't moved. His figure faded into the fog like something permanent, like a statue meant to watch over the runway long after the flights had changed. In my lap, I unfolded the handkerchief again, smoothed the patch, traced the V with my finger. My mind drifted to a memory, a younger version of us, me and Vanessa hugging awkwardly the night before I left for training. She stuffed a handkerchief into my duffel then too. In case you cry, she'd said smirking, or sweat like a human. There are things you can't ask for. Forgiveness, family, closure. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you get something close. Something stitched into cloth. Something that says this mattered. You mattered. That night in my new quarters, I opened my journal again. On the last page, I wrote, maybe we don't need to win, just to hold the line long enough for others to step forward. And, for now, that was enough. Washington, in October, has a kind of burnished hush to it, the kind of quiet that makes you walk. Slower, breathe deeper. I arrived early for the JDLP opening session, My uniform pressed my name stitched above my chest like it had always belonged there. Inside the auditorium, the seats filled slowly. Brass civilian strategists, junior officers with ambition and nerves tangled together. I recognized a few faces. Most I didn't. That made it easier. The night before, I sat at the edge of the hotel bed with note cards in my lap and 3 drafts on the desk. Every version sounded too clean, too careful. I kept hearing Sophia's voice. No gloss, no evasion. At 2:17 a.m., I rewrote it one final time, crossed out half the sentences, and circled only the ones that made my pulse spike. I was the second speaker, sandwiched between a cybersecurity expert and a Navy commander known for his decisive command style. When they called my name, I didn't hesitate. I walked up to the podium, adjusted the mic, and looked out. Rows of faces expectant, curious, possibly skeptical. I didn't start with a joke. I didn't thank the committee or offer a flattering summary of the programme. I opened with 7 words. I got slapped at my promotion ceremony. There was a flicker through the room. Surprise, attention, a few stiffened spines, 1 cough, that was all. I went on. It was my sister, in front of peer subordinates and senior officers. She walked on stage and hit me, and I stood there. I let the silence settle. Not long. Just enough. I stood because I was trained to. Because that moment, though personal, was public. Because dignity isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you choose to stand afterward. I spoke of Vanessa briefly, of what we lost and how we lost it, of what it meant to let pain exist in the same space as discipline. I didn't apologize for her. I didn't defend myself. I told the truth. I had failed her in ways that no medal or mission could offset. But that didn't mean I had to fail the post I held. The moment demanded steadiness, and so I gave it. We talk about courage like it's loud, I said, like it charges in weapons blazing. But sometimes courage is silent. Sometimes it means holding still while the room watches, while your dignity bleeds alongside your pride. I could see them listening, not nodding, not smiling, just holding it, and I gave them more. I shared how in the weeks that followed, whispers circled the base, rumours sharpened by silence, and how I never once issued a denial nor sought an explanation. Because some truths don't need dressing, and some wounds must be carried openly if they're ever to stop aching. Being a leader doesn't mean commanding the room, I said. It means absorbing impact, holding shape, making space for others to keep moving even when you're the reason the ground shakes. My voice didn't waver. My hands never trembled. The room held still. Then, after a beat longer than expected, someone clapped. Then, another. It was not raucous. It didn't swell. It spread slowly like warmth in a cold room. A quiet kind of agreement. Not admiration, recognition. A woman near the front blinked back tears. A man in uniform leaned forward, elbows on knees. In the back row, a younger officer scribbled something furiously into a notebook. Across the aisle, a civilian paused mid-sentence in typing and just watched. Later in the hallway outside, a young lieutenant stopped me. He hesitated, then said, "Ma'am, I didn't know you could say things like that and still wear the uniform." I smiled. Then I did something right. I closed with my mother's line. She used to say, "You don't have to hug to hold on." So, it took me 34 years to understand that. As I stepped down from the stage, I caught sight of someone in the very last row, an older woman unfamiliar to me, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Maybe a military parent, maybe just someone who'd seen enough silence to recognize its breaking. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like the woman who was slapped. I felt like the one who stayed standing. A week later, I found myself in a quiet barracks room at Maxwell, where I'd report for a temporary post before the next rotation. The walls were bare, the kind of beige that swallows sound, and the mirror above the desk caught the early light like it had something to say. I stood in front of it, my service blues freshly pressed a new badge in my hand. It had arrived that morning in a plain box. No ceremony, just logistics. I studied it for a moment. Silver edges, polished centre, the insignia still faintly warm from the mail. I lifted it to my chest, hesitated, then clipped it into place. It looked right, almost too right, like it had always been there waiting. I stared at myself, not out of vanity, out of verification. Then, slowly, deliberately, I unclipped it. I held it again, turned it in my fingers, set it on the desk, and clipped it back on. This time, I looked myself directly in the eye. There were lines there I hadn't seen before. Not from age, from endurance. I smiled, not because I felt proud, but because for once I didn't need anyone else to tell me who I was. There was no knock at the door, no friend waiting outside with a handshake, no familiar voice on speakerphone saying, "You did good, just me." And that was enough. That night, after chow, I returned to my room and found a padded envelope slid under the door. No return address. I opened it cautiously. Inside, a photo. 2 people stood in the picture. A teenage boy barely shaving, buzzed hair awkward stance, and a woman I knew without needing confirmation. Vanessa, arms crossed, standing beside him, like she dared the world to question his place there. The boy wore fatigues, not regulation yet, but unmistakable. And on his shoulder, stitched, tilted just slightly out of line, was the same squadron patch I had once buried in the bottom of my drawer. The one Vanessa gave me when I left. The one that came back repaired. The one now sewn onto a new body for a new chapter. Taped to the back of the photo was a note. 4 words, block letters. "He asked for yours." I sat on the edge of the bed photo in hand thumb grazing the patch. His eyes reminded me of Vanessa's when we were kids, focused, guarded, always ready to run or defend. But his stance, that awkward attempt at posture, was mine. I saw it in old photos of myself at 18, unsure how to belong, but trying anyway. The realization felt warm, steadying. I didn't cry, I didn't write back, but I knew. Somewhere my sister had let go of something, and somewhere I had reached far enough to feel it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning stitched into someone else's sleeve. Later that night, I stood before the mirror again. I adjusted my uniform, straightened the lines, and polished my shoes one last time. My hand brushed over the badge. I let my fingers rest there, and I remembered the first time I'd earned one. Back then, it was all about proving I could keep up. Now, it was about proving I could stay still. I imagined what Mom might say if she saw me now. Maybe she'd laugh that I still couldn't hold a hug for long. Or maybe she'd just nod, the way she always did when she knew something had changed. In a drawer, I found the patch Vanessa had mailed back years ago. I placed it beside the photo on the desk. And I said softly, almost like prayer, "You don't have to hug to hold on." The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the base. Crisp air, empty paths. A young officer passed me and nodded. His eyes dropped to my badge. He didn't salute, just smiled. And I nodded back. For once, I didn't wonder what people were thinking. For once, I didn't rehearse explanations in my head. I had survived 1,000 quiet cuts, and I was still here. Back in my room, I stood before the mirror again. Uniform on, boots laced, badge in place. I looked at myself and said out loud this time, "I stayed standing, and I won't step back." No one clapped, no embrace, no headline, just breath. And a different kind of honour. One I stitched myself. And if you're someone who's been standing silently through your own storms, family fractures, unseen sacrifices, long nights, with no applause, I want you to know this, you're not alone. Healing isn't loud. Sometimes it looks like waking up and making your bed. Sometimes it sounds like a single breath in a quiet room. And sometimes it comes stitched into a life you've quietly kept whole. In today's world, many of us are learning that we don't need to carry everything alone anymore. Whether through therapy, community support journaling, or simply telling our stories out loud, we're building new ways to hold each other, even from a distance. So if this story found you, I hope it reminded you that dignity can live in stillness, and honor can grow in the places where no one's looking. If stories like this help you feel seen, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. We're building something here, one story at a time, one breath at a time, and we'd love to have you standing with us.